then can you please put your hands together, give a massive cheer for Linsay McCullough.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I hope you're going to enjoy this one. In the early 1940s, when America joined the Second World War, 5 Hollywood directors who were at the height of their fame, their power, their kind of creative lives, volunteered to join the Army Signal Corps to make propaganda, to make newsreels on behalf of the war effort. And they were John Ford, who was known for his westerns, including Stagecoach. There was a kind of young, hip director called John Huston, who had just made and had a big success with The Maltese Falcon. And in doing that, he kind of invented film noir. There was George Stevens, who was known for his kind of light-hearted romantic comedies, including Swing Time, that he'd just made with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. There was a director called William Wyler, who was known for what was called at the time women's pictures. So he made Wuthering Heights and various other films with Bette Davis. And there was also Frank Capra, who was known for his comedies at the time. So he had made It Happened One Night, he had made Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And at this time, he's probably the most popular director in Hollywood. He's had massive, massive success. So these 5 men volunteer to become part of this, the Army kind of communications and propaganda unit. The four of them were sent to Europe and to the Pacific, but as head of the unit, Frank Capra stayed in the United States, and it was up to him to come up with some kind of fairly quick propaganda. You'll probably know that before Pearl Harbor, lots of Americans, the public and politicians, were kind of ambivalent at best and kind of downright hostile to actually joining the war. So Frank Capra felt that immediately we've got to talk about the reasons why we're in this war. So he was looking at the propaganda that was coming out of Nazi Germany and Italy, including this film, Triumph of the Will, which was Leni Riefenstahl's documentary about Hitler's rallies. And when Frank Capra saw this, he was kind of despairing and dumbfounded, and he's kind of saying to his team, I think we've lost the war, because I don't see how we're fighting against this in terms of propaganda and information. So what he decided to do was to use this footage and to add a commentary and to make films specifically for the kind of the fighting forces who 2 months ago were farmers and shopkeepers and mechanics, and now they were kind of the front line of the war against Hitler. And so he made a series of films called Why We Fight, aimed very much at that audience, mostly using stock footage, but with some kind of additional army footage and animations done by Walt Disney. So this was very much a kind of joint thing. The directors who were sent abroad, John Huston was sent to a kind of strategically important refueling station in the Pacific called the Aleutian Islands, and he made a film there about the troops and their daily life. William Wyler was seconded to a kind of a bomber crew, and their bomber was called the Memphis Belle, and so he made a documentary about them. And this was at the beginning of the war, so what we were getting was very positive ideas, very positive images about the troops getting ready to fight, and this is a war that's kind of just. As time goes on, though, during the war, things are getting darker and darker and darker. So John Huston, who had been in the Aleutians and had made this Day in the Life film, is now sent to Europe, and he films the Battle of San Pietro, which was part of the Monte Cassino campaign in Italy. And this is one of the bloodiest European campaigns of the war. So he's seeing kind of very different things, and the footage that he's making is being sent back to the States. So suddenly people in America are seeing very different things as well. John Ford and George Stevens, two of the other directors, they are sent to film the D-Day landings in 1944. First day of the D-Day landings, 10,000 men killed on both sides. And again, this is the footage that's coming back. After D-Day, although it was a turning point in the war wasn't over, John Ford came back to America, but George Stevens stayed embedded with his army unit as they marched through France, towards Germany, towards Berlin. And so he was with the troops that liberated Dachau. So this is a man who's made Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers films, and now he's filming the kind of liberation of a concentration camp, of a death camp. And he said that it became clear that he wasn't making a documentary anymore. He wasn't filming newsreel. He wasn't filming propaganda. He was gathering evidence. So after the war, what did they do? William Wyler, who on another documentary he'd made about a bomber, had lost hearing in both his ears, regained partial hearing in one of his ears, and that's all he would ever have for the rest of his life. But he came back and he made this film, The Best Years of Our Lives, and it's about 3 returning veterans, 2 professional actors, Frederick March and Dana Andrews, and then on the left of this picture we've got Harold Russell, who wasn't a professional actor but was a real-life wartime amputee. And this is a very kind of hard-hitting film about the difficulties of men reintegrating back into society. So that's what William Wyler did. John Huston, the last thing he did for the army was he followed a bunch of soldiers who were in a residential hospital. They had come back as well. This was a true story. Best Years of Our Lives is fiction, but this one was a true story. And it's a documentary about men with battle fatigue, PTSD as we would call it these days. And again, this is a very candid documentary. We're seeing these men, they're crying, they're broken. It's very, in some ways, invasive because they're having one-to-one sessions with the psychiatrist, and this is all filmed. And so this is a very, very kind of dark film. The army hated it and wouldn't show it publicly until the 1980s. So John Huston is doing this dark film. William Wyler is making his dark film. George Stevens is editing his Dachau footage for the Nuremberg trials. And this is going to be a turning point in the trials when people see this actual footage. So Frank Capra, who was head of the unit and remained stateside, was seeing all this footage as it came back. He had seen everything that every one of these directors had made. And so what was he doing at the end of the war? What was the very next project that he did? He made a heartwarming story about a Christmas angel. Has anyone not seen It's a Wonderful Life? I think most people have seen it, but just to give you a quick recap, if you haven't seen it for a while, it concerns George Bailey, who's James Stewart, and he lives in a small town called Bedford Falls. He longs for adventure, but he's trapped in this little town by his sense of responsibility and community. He runs a small bank called the Building and Loan, and some money goes missing, and George is facing ruin. He decides the only way out of this is to kill himself, and to prevent this, a trainee angel called Clarence is sent from heaven to stop him. And how he does that is by showing George what life would have been like had George never been born. So when you say it that way, it does sound relatively bright and good-hearted and happy Christmas and everyone's happy. But this is a film that's steeped in death and despair and disappointment. Again, happy Christmas. It's a heartwarming film. And so I'm going to show you a clip right now of kind of how this disappointment shows itself for George. At this point in the story, in the clip, George was due to go to college, but his father died, and so George had to stay and take care of the business, and so his younger brother, Harry, went to college instead. It's now 4 years later. Harry's coming back from college, and the deal was Harry comes back, takes over the business, George gets to start his adventure. Let's see what happens.
Fields. Wanted man with construction experience. Here's the Yukon. One right here. Wanted man with engineering experience. There she blows. You know what the 3 most exciting sounds in the world are?
Uh-huh. Breakfast is served, lunch is served, dinner...
No. Anchor chains, plane motors, and train whistles.
Peanut.
There's the professor now. Old Professor
Why, old George, Geographic Explorer Bailey. What, no husky dogs, no sleds? Uncle Billy, you haven't changed a bit.
Nobody ever changes here, you know
boy,
that.
am I glad to see you.
Say, where's Mother?
She's home cooking the fatted calf. Come on, let's go.
Oh, wait a minute. George, Uncle Billy, I want you to meet Ruth.
Hello. How do you do?
Ruth Dakin.
Ruth Dakin Bailey, if you don't mind.
That's right. Well, I wired you. I had a surprise. Here she is. Meet the wife.
What do you know?
Wife.
How do you do? Congratulations. What am I doing? Congratulations!
Come then, Harry, you
They're
said
married, these two. Why don't you tell
Oh,
somebody?
I can't wait to
Nobody
see
tells me anything.
You really married?
Why, yeah.
Hey, what's a pretty girl like you doing marrying this two-headed brother of mine?
Well, I'll tell you, it's purely mercenary. My father offered him a job.
Oh, we got you in the job. Well, Harry's come running over.
George, about that job. Bruce spoke out of turn. I never said I'd take it. You've been holding the bag here for 4 years, and... Well, I won't let you down, George. I would like to... Well, wait a minute. I forgot the bags. I'll be right back.
Surprise to me. This is the new Mrs. Bailey, my nephew's wife.
How do you do?
Old friend of the Bailey. Just call in here now. We're taking her home. And I want to tell you that we're going to give the biggest party this town ever saw. I want you to come and do
Harry, I'll be right here. Will you, Harry? How are you?
You certainly
George. That's all Harry ever talks about.
Ruth, what about this job?
Oh, well, my father owns a glass factory in Buffalo. He wants to get Harry started in the research business.
Well, is it a good job?
Oh, yes, very. Not much money, but good future, you know.
Yeah.
Harry's a genius at research. My father just fell in love with him.
You did, too.
So there we are. George is trapped once more. So this film was made in 1946, and the kind of elements that were so important during the war, community and pulling together and sacrifice and everybody working towards a common thing. In this film, it does not bring George joy, it brings him to suicidal despair. And this is also a film about death. Death just haunts this picture right from the start. So when we at the start of the film, we see George as a young boy. The first thing we see him doing is saving his brother Harry's life when they're sledging and Harry goes through the ice. George saves his life, but diving into the icy water has cost George his hearing in one ear. And this means that when the Second World War comes, this scene is set in 1919, but when the Second World War comes, George is rated 4F because of his ear and doesn't fight. So even that very dangerous adventure that war might have been is denied George. But he saved his brother's life. Also in this early part, George works at a pharmacy with Mr. Gower. Now, Mr. Gower has just had word that his son, Mr. Gower's own son, has died of the flu. This is 1919. And he drinks through his grief, and so he's very drunk at one point. He makes a mistake in the medication for a young kid who's got some kind of disease, but he puts poison in the capsules instead. And George notices that, stops it, and so he saved another life. So this is 10 minutes into the film. We've already had kind of 2 narrow missed deaths and 1 actual death in terms of Mr. Gower. 10 minutes into the film is generally when I'm sobbing like a baby as well, so I'll try and control myself tonight. George's father dies as well, and then at the end, of course, towards the end, we have George's own possible death. He goes to the Scrooge of the town, Mr. Potter, and when he's facing ruin, when this money's gone missing. Potter wants him to fail, because Potter wants to kind of gather all the power for himself, and he wants the building and loan to fail. But George says to him, Mr. Potter, can you help me out? I'm facing ruin. And Potter says to him, well, what collateral have you got? And he said, well, I've got a life insurance policy. And Potter says to him, George, you're worth more dead than alive. So we've had the disappointment, we've had the death in this film, and the despair. I mean, this is, if you've seen it, you'll know that this performance that James Stewart gives is absolutely incredible. Just a really, really powerful performance. So I mentioned this is Frank Capra's first film after the war. This is James Stewart's first film after the war as well. He was among the first of the kind of Hollywood stars to sign up. He had a very distinguished career in the Air Corps, ended the war a colonel, having been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. So he's been away as well. And when he left in the early 1940s, he was at the tip-top of his career as well. He'd just won the Oscar for the Philadelphia Story. He'd had great acclaim. So he's coming back. He doesn't know if he'll be remembered. Capra doesn't know if he'll be remembered. And I just think when we look at some of these faces that he makes kind of in the film, some of the acting performance that he gives with his face, is it too far-fetched to think we might be seeing his own wartime trauma in this film? In the world where George was never born, his lovely little town of Bedford Falls has become Pottersville, a very kind of dark and dangerous place. In Bedford Falls, George's best friends are Bert the cop and Ernie the taxi driver. Apparently, the Bert and Ernie puppets in Sesame Street were not named after them, but I find that kind of hard to believe. I think they probably were. But anyway, this is Bert and Ernie in Bedford Falls. And this is Bert and Ernie in Pottersville. Quite a sinister picture again, but possibly even kind of quite fascistic. So again, we're seeing the darkness in this film. And even love for George is despair and desperation. And this next clip I'm going to show you is just one of my favourite things in the whole film. It's when he goes to visit an old flame, Mary, and they kind of discover that they are still really meant for each other.
Hello, Sam. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. It's good to hear your voice again.
Oh, well, that's awfully sweet of you, Sam. There's an old friend of yours here, George Bailey.
You mean old Mossback George?
Yes, old Mossback George.
Yeehaw, put him on.
Well, just a minute. I'll call him George.
He doesn't want to speak to George, you idiot.
He does so. He asked for him. George, Sam wants to speak to you.
Hi, Sam.
Well, George Baileyovsky. Hey, a fine pal you are. What are you trying to do, steal my girl?
Well, what do you mean? Nobody's trying to steal anybody's girl. Here's Mary.
No, wait a minute. I want to talk to
Here, you.
Rhoda. Tell Mary to get on the extension.
You talk.
Mother's on the extension. I am not. We can both hear. Come here. We're listening, Sam.
Well, look, I have a big deal coming up that's going to make us all rich. George, do you remember that night in Martini's bar when you told me you'd read someplace about making plastics out of soybeans? Chili beans. You remember, out of soybeans.
Yeah, soybeans, yeah.
Well, listen, Dad snapped up the idea, and he's going to build a factory outside of Rochester. How do you like that?
Rochester? Well, why Rochester?
Well, why not? Can you think of anything better?
Well, I don't know. Why not right here? You remember that old tool and machinery works? Well, you tell your father you can get that for a song, and all the labor he wants, too. Half the town was thrown out of work when they closed down.
Was that so? Well, I'll tell him. Hey, that sounds great. Oh, baby, I knew you'd come through. Now, here's the point. Mary, you're in on this, too. Now, listen. Have you got any money?
Money? Yeah. Well, a little.
Well, now, listen. I want you to put every cent you've got into our stock. Do you hear? And, George, I may have a job for you. That is, unless you're still married to that broken-down building and loan. Well, this is the biggest thing since radio, and I'm letting you in on the ground floor. Oh, Mary.
Well, I'm here.
Will you tell that guy I'm giving him the chance of a lifetime? Do you hear? The chance of a lifetime.
He says it's the chance of a lifetime.
Now, you listen to me. I don't want any plastics, and I don't want any ground floors, and I don't want to get married ever to anyone. You understand that? I want to do what I want to do. And you're...
George.
Mary.
So that's George trapped again. So this film was made by Frank Capra, and when he came back from the war, he decided to set up his own studio. He'd been working with a major studio. He wanted the freedom that his own studio would give him. So he set up Liberty Films with our old friends, William Wyler and George Stevens, and that's the three of them, two directors who'd also been away. They had all kind of come together to make their dream project, and Liberty Films was going to give them the chance to do that. It's a Wonderful Life was the first of these, but everybody was going to get their chance to make the film that they wanted to make. It's a Wonderful Life was a really expensive film. The whole town of Bedford Falls was an outdoor set. It covered 4 acres. There were 75 separate shop fronts that were built. So it was an expensive film to make, and there was a lot riding on it. The whole of Liberty Films basically was riding on the shoulders of this film. And it didn't do that well. Now, the accepted wisdom is that it was a flop at the time, and it wasn't quite a commercial flop. Critics didn't like it, with one notable exception, which was the critic of the Daily Worker, the communist paper in the UK, loved it because they said it shows exactly how capitalism kills people. But critics in America didn't like it. The public went to see it, and had it been a standalone film, it would have done okay at the box office, but it wasn't a standalone film. It had the whole of Liberty Films sitting on it, and unfortunately did not make enough money for that, and Liberty Films folded after It's a Wonderful Life. It was nominated for 5 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor. However, it lost in every category to the film I mentioned before, The Best Years of Our Lives, done by William Wyler. So what happened after It's a Wonderful Life? Frank Capra had gone from before the war being the most popular director. He could do no wrong. All his films kind of turned to gold, to kind of meh afterwards. He never really recovered from It's a Wonderful Life not really being a success. He made other films, they didn't do much. He outlived his popularity, he outlived his success. James Stewart carried on for the next 30, 35 years as a major star, but his roles started to be a little more kind of morally ambiguous, a little darker in character. So we have him here in Vertigo for Hitchcock. He made a series of westerns with a director called Anthony Mann in the 50s and 60s. And again, these are very, very dark characters. As for the film itself, it would have died a death. We might not have heard of it had not there been a clerical error in 1974, which meant that the copyright didn't get renewed. And so suddenly it's a free product. TV picks it up, starts to play it every Christmas, and it starts to snowball. And this is why it's such a perennial today. So a film that's very much about getting a second chance at life itself gets a second chance at life through TV. The first time I did this talk, somebody said, why didn't Capra make a war film? And I didn't really have a very, like his other directors, why didn't he make a film that directly related to the war when he came back? And I didn't have a very good answer. But I think, thinking about it, he did make a film that's very much related to the war. This last scene, the Christmas Eve scene, is set in Christmas 1945. So this is showing in cinemas and reflects a time when lots of men would have been coming back from the dead, maybe to a changed world. It starts off very cosmically with the kind of voice of God instructing the angels as to what's going to happen. But then the focus is very much on the difference that an individual can make. Again, that's going to talk to people in 1945 who are just back from the war, 1946. But I think the thing that Capra did well was to kind of bring light to where there was darkness. He was all about community building. His films are all about kind of community and people working together. I mean, to the point where people find them sometimes so sentimental that they're called Capricorn. That was a phrase that was used about him at the time, that they were corny. But to me, this is his absolute response to the war. And he's saying, where people were numb, I want them to feel again. I want to show them once more that life can be wonderful. Thanks very much.
Linsay McCullough. Thank you, Linsay.